You could even take it one notch further and say that Europe isn't even in the race when it comes to building its own semiconductor manufacturing industry.
Europa jako kontynent przestał się ścigać w masowej produkcji układów scalonych. Zamiast tego przejął kontrolę nad elementem, który odpowiada za rozwój najbardziej zaawansowanych chipów. Marc Hijink jako dziennikarz i autor książki o firmie produkującej takie maszyny przeniknął w struktury ASML, by od wewnątrz opisać tę firmę. W naszej rozmowie wyjaśnia, jak ten mechanizm zmusza Stany Zjednoczone do ustępstw oraz odpowiada na pytanie, czy Chiny są w stanie przegonić europejską technologię. Odkrywa model działania, który gwarantuje Europie miejsce przy decyzyjnym stole bez wyprodukowania ani jednego nowoczesnego procesora. Zapraszam do rozmowy z Markiem Hijinkiem. Hello, Mark. Good to have you with me.
Great to be here.
Mark, so where is Europe actually in that technological world today?
Well, if you would phrase it like, is Europe losing the race in chips? So you could think about this race as Europe used to be a part of the race, but actually isn't anymore. This is really a thing which I also describe in my book, that the entire manufacturing of semiconductors has moved to Asia, which is all a consequence of the scale economy. It's easier, it's more efficient to combine all the talents and the capital in a couple of places in the world, which is really a small corner. If you look at all the countries that are really involved in chip manufacturing, it's like a small triangle. Of course, has Taiwan in it, South Korea, but also Japan. And now, of course, China is also playing an important role. But there you see the special skills you need and the capital and the discipline and the culture needed for semiconductor manufacturing. And ASML quickly found out during its course, its journey from a very small startup in the Netherlands to this huge juggernaut it is today, that the semiconductor market and the manufacturing industry was moving from the US mainly and partly Europe to Asia. And they acted accordingly. So they were really keen on getting these huge new players in Asia, which were, of course, Samsung and TSMC. For me, it was a great adventure to describe how TSMC and ASML were connected in the very early stages of both companies. So ASML was founded in 1984, and quickly in 1987 it already had this deal with TSMC when TSMC was practically nothing. It was just an idea by Morris Chang, and throughout the decades these companies really got to learn each other and got to cooperate in quite a unique way. And that's the story that has been described in Focus, the ASML Way. But the consequence is of course, that by all this globalization, the amount of chip manufacturing in Europe has been decreasing. Even though we had a CHIPS Act in 22, I think it was like 4 years ago, the share of the European Union in chip manufacturing hasn't grown. And it's not because it hasn't grown, but others have grown even faster. So,
it was about 9%, if I remember correctly, at this point of time.
You're pretty optimistic. I think it was 8%. And if the other superpowers grow faster, it means your share in manufacturing is decreasing. And I don't think you only have to look at volume. It's also about creating a market. And Europe doesn't have its market. One of the reasons that that Asia was an attractive place to concentrate all this semiconductor manufacturing is that the electronics industry is there as well. So now you see a shift, for example, in the US, where there's a huge appetite for AI data centers. So it makes sense to also start producing chips there because there's an end market. And in Europe, it used to be the automotive industry that was the biggest end market, but that automotive industry is now under threat by, competitive Chinese players. So there has to be, some sort of huge customer base in Europe for chip manufacturers to start realizing, hey, we should do some manufacturing in Europe because there it's a huge demand for AI data centers or new kinds of cars that need huge amounts of compute, and you name them. Maybe a robotics industry.
I was kind of asking this question from the very beginning because a couple of weeks ago, another book author, Chris Miller, in Foreign Affairs essay, he stated that Europe is actually losing the chips race. And in that article, he was kind of pointing out that Europe is now living a dream about the self-reliance. And from his perspective, in that essay, he mentioned that Europe maybe should focus more on the niches than trying to be fully self-reliant in the chip industry. And he was pointing out the ASML and also German Merck. What is your perspective on that? Are you in line with what Chris Miller was stating, or you have a different perspective on that?
I think you could even take it one notch further and say that Europe isn't even in the race when it comes to building its own semiconductor manufacturing industry. Of course, there are expansions. For example, ESMC in Dresden, a couple of the biggest efforts that were supposed to be in the CHIPS Act, like Intel expanding in Magdeburg. Well, it's off the table now because Intel doesn't have the money, it doesn't have the customers, and the US is not very much inclined to shift production to move over production to Europe because, the relationships have changed. And on the other project, a huge project of Global Foundries in Cole in France, it was postponed. So there's not a huge success yet. So I agree with Chris that Europe has its strength in niches, but these are very important niches. So ASML is like a chokehold on the entire AI industry because you need these advanced lithography machines, these EV tools that only ASML can produce, and to manufacture the advanced chips you see in iPhones, but also in NVIDIA's AI chips, but also in AMD's AI chips. Even Intel, which has its own chip manufacturing facilities, uses TSMC as a foundry because there they have the access to the most advanced production processes. So, and what they all have in common is that they need lithography from ASML as a crucial element to get to this advanced level of compute. So it's not just a niche. And what you see, for example, last week, I was in Leuven in Belgium, where there was the official opening of the Nano IC research. It's like a test line for the most advanced semiconductors of the future for the next decade. And there you see this cooperation not only with ASML, but also with IMEC, the Research Institute, and a lot of other institutes throughout Europe. And it's a combined effort of all these companies, not only ASML as a tool maker, but also KLA, Applied, the usual players, also ASM International from the Netherlands. They all work together to create the new building blocks of these very advanced next generation AI chips. So only Europe has this, is like a neutral ground for all the companies to work together and build the building blocks for the new future generation of chips. And I think it's really an essential element. And one of the reasons, of course, Europe is a kind of a neutral player is the fact that our chip manufacturing facilities are relatively small compared to Asia and the US. This is also one of the reasons that ASML was successful, because ASML was not connected to a country that had a huge chip manufacturing industry. So it was considered a neutral player, even in Japan.
From that perspective, do you think Europe can actually join that race, or it's rather the lost thing and it should more look for space in these niches which were mentioned here?
So getting back to my first answer is that first you need an end user market here in Europe. That's the only reason for chip manufacturers to actually start shifting or copying production. And for that end user market to grow, you need a healthy industrial base. So that could be an AI gigafactory, for example, or an industrial base based on automotive industry. But that needs time to grow. And just throwing in volume is not really the way to go. And I think one of the ambitions of the first CHIPS Act, like we want 20% market share in this area, was too ambitious and actually was quite impossible to reach. And I don't think there's a lot of value in just adding the volume. You really have to make sure that you have a seat on the table. And if you look, for example, at the Nano IC project, creating these crucial building blocks for a new generation of chips gives you a seat at the table. And I think Europe is definitely aware that it has to create a more sovereign entity if you compare it to the power of China and the US. But on the other hand, it also realizes that these interdependencies in the industry will remain. Even if you look at the US, which is building out huge TSMC fabs, they're relatively small to the volumes that can be created in Taiwan. And I think it's just one of the things we've learned since COVID, since the first time that the CHIPS Act was announced. Volume is not everything. It's also about creating value.
And that seat you have mentioned actually assured Netherlands the seat in the discussion about the Pax Silica Pact, which was discussed with US representatives, but also with other countries at the end of December of 2025. So that shows that there is a certain way to achieve that. And let's speak a bit about ASML itself, yeah? Because there is plenty of companies in Europe. But what makes ASML so unique that it achieved such a big success in this technological world if we compare it to the other European companies?
I think what makes ASML unique is that it succeeded in being the biggest player, the dominant player in the most capital-intensive industry you could imagine, which is lithography, because these litho tools are the most expensive tools in the shed. So one of their machines, the highly advanced generation, it costs about 400 million euros. Of course, there's a lot of other machines as well that cost way less, but it has the capability of industrializing technology that is only available in research labs. So for that to be successful, it had to do a lot of learning cycles together with its customers. And that is a completely different mindset than the way the industry used to work before ASML entered the market. So when ASML started in the 80s and the 90s, mainly Japanese players like Nikon and Canon dominated. And they built these perfect machines, but they weren't really flexible. And ASML was successful in getting customers on this journey of tweaking together. So they built systems that didn't work initially. They put them in a research area of the chip fab, and then they started tweaking together. And that was a way to create faster learning cycles. And it helped ASML to a bigger market share. And then it got to this moment in time when they were, well, I think they had about 50 to 60% of the market. So they got more capex than their competitors. And throughout the entire 4 decades, they kept their R&D levels at 50 to 20%, even during the downturns. And I think that kind of set ASML apart, that they were really focused on a special niche. And they knew as long as we keep our R&D levels up to speed and make sure that we out-innovate our competitors, we can get to this market share in the end, dominate the entire market. So for that to become real, they needed a roadmap that looked ahead like 10 to 15 years. And I think ASML stuck to its roadmap. and that was easier for a company that was relatively small. If you look at their competitors, for example, the Japanese competitors, they were like conglomerates, so they used their own lenses and a lot of their own technology. So when there was a huge downturn in the electronics industry, often the litho tools also were hurt by budget cuts. And in the case of ASML, these downturns were, well, spread out over a huge ecosystem of suppliers. So ASML is basically kind of a system architect, pretty agile and lean if you compare to other companies. And a lot of the value is in the supply chain. 800 suppliers, of course, the well-known names like Zeiss and Trumpf. And I think that's a kind of a unique element that sets ASML apart from a lot of other companies. Now, of course, ASML has grown into this juggernaut, so it also is experiencing problems with, well, keeping this agile attitude, because there's a lot of bureaucracy within the company, because it has to grow accordingly with the entire pace of the semiconductor industry, which is supposed to double in size in the coming years.
If we speak about that innovation culture, yeah, and also the supply chains, that was also something very surprising for me, that ASML is so strongly driven by its supplier partnership, and here the Zeiss cooperation is one of the key elements, I would say.
Well, Adrian, it's if you look at it without ASML, Zeiss would be, well, nothing is too far-fetched, but it wouldn't be as prosperous as it is now. And ASML, when it was spun off of Philips, it didn't have anything. So it really needed an optic system supplier, and Zeiss was the best they could get because it's the best in the world back then. And it still is, because these companies have started sharing IPs and sharing ideas. And but for that relationship to become that bond of trust that it is today, like this marriage, they really had to conquer a lot of commercial and cultural differences. And for me, it was such a joy to describe how these small differences between the Dutch attitude and the German attitude of doing business really got to this level that it's now a great cooperation.
And what do you think, to what extent also the leadership played a role here? In your book, you mentioned that Martin van der Brink is very often compared to Steve Jobs, but definitely he's not such a media person like Steve Jobs was. So from your perspective, when you were writing the book and you were interacting with ASML people, how this leadership culture, because technology is one thing, but also the people who lead companies is the other thing.
The reason why I'm comparing him to Steve Jobs is, of course, Steve Jobs was well known because he was the founder of a company that makes consumer electronics, and ASML is builds a tool that is for a niche, just a handful of players. But what Martin and Steve Jobs had in common was that they were very good at convincing their customers. So Martin van der Brink was brutally honest with ASML's customers, sometimes too honest. He just pointed out problems to them that they even didn't know of. But they really liked the idea that he was brutally honest and blunt, sometimes very direct. So that style was kind of a good match within the semiconductor industry, because if you beat around the bush or are too careful or too hesitant, then you lose time. And the semiconductor industry is all about speed. And so Martin van der Brink was good at that. Internally, he was also employee number 0. So he was one of the few people that oversaw the entire history of ASML. And actually, a lot of the preparing research for ASML's litho tools were already done at Philips in NetLab. And Martin realized that. So he was aware that this entire journey of the lithography tool getting better and better all the time, every time, was not because of him, but because there was this spirit of innovation. And Martin had the same, well, I call it a reality distortion field. So if you're interacting with him, he can be very challenging, sometimes in a way that people left the room crying. But he, once you get his trust, he's also very inspiring. And that's, I think, one of the qualities that Steve Jobs also had, that if you feel inspired by your leader, who also likes to be challenged, in the case of Martin van den Brink, so he was not very much into hierarchy. So ASML back in the day was a pretty flat organization. So Martin expected to be challenged as well, because that's how we thought you inspire creativity, and you need creativity to solve all these complex problems you have to you counter in developing lithography machines, because it's not one trade. It's really a combination of physics, of chemistry, of mechatronics, and of a lot of compute and data. So you need software as well. And for all these disciplines to work together and to help each other, you need a kind of a transparent, open, innovative culture. And Martin van den Brink helped found that culture. He was very proud of that.
When you describe this, I cannot run away from the association with NVIDIA, because to a certain extent, also Taya Kim was describing that in his book, The NVIDIA Way. This flat structure was helping in developing NVIDIA's innovation. And if we compare these two, it looks very similar. And maybe to a certain extent, this US spirit kind of, let me say, is also in here in that development process.
Yeah, but I guess there's one big difference when it comes to the NVIDIA way and the ASML way, is that ASML is basically a company about hardware. And of course, NVIDIA makes its hardware as well, but in the end, it's a design company. So these are brilliant minds designing the fastest GPUs on Earth. But it's a different ballgame than building machines that take a couple of planes to travel to your customer. And they have to work like 24/7. And they often work for decades. So if you look at the first generation of ASML's machines, these are machines that were designed and produced back in the 90s. They're still running in fabs these days. Of course, they still are serviced and sometimes updated or upgraded, but the basic machine is still running, spitting out wafers.
Speaking of ASML Way, it seems to be a very bumpy way, because if we take a look on tries from China to replicate the EUV technology, also right now United States startups are kind of trying to make that happen. Yeah. Also in the past, what you mentioned before, Japanese competition also dumped that idea. From your perspective, when we talk about China and the last year's success of moving the DUV to 7 nanometer in their Huawei processors, do you think that replication of ASML Way is actually possible for China?
Well, if you look at pure physics, of course, but I don't think the question is if China will succeed in building an alternative lithography tool or technology. The question will it be economically viable? And will it be as successful as ASML's offering or any kind of offering? So let's zoom out. First of all, your remark about the DUV reaching 7 nanometers. Well, that's not a surprise, because if you look where Intel got stuck, they got stuck at 10 nanometers. Okay, you can do 7 nanometers with multi-patterning, but yield is going to drop. So it's becoming less attractive And that really is a challenge, I think. So in the end, EUV will save you a lot of money when it comes to mass manufacturing of more advanced chips. And you need it to build more energy efficient chips. And if you look at where the constraint is now in the AI economy or the AI race, it's basically about the access to power. So if you have more efficient chips, you can create more compute for artificial intelligence. Now, zooming in on the attempts in China, of course, it makes sense that China develops its own technology because they want to be sovereign. They don't want to depend on Western tool manufacturers too much. And you see that happening in all parts of the semiconductor industry. So a lot of alternatives are already available for tool makers from the US. And it makes sense that China is also trying to find an alternative for ASML, like they've done for many years with SMEE, which is a company that used to be in back-end, but is now also developing its own front-end tools. But chip manufacturers are still going to consider, is this economically viable or not? So the only way for Chinese competition to grow is to have more learning cycles, because that's the way you get to this new level and create new bonds of trust with your customers. So I think in the end, ASML is worried that by being submit to these hefty export controls, there's a huge opportunity for Chinese competitors to find new market share in the Chinese market. So there's a balance there. So basically, ASML has to comply with whatever export controls the Dutch government decides to implement. And I think the only way to prevent or to protect the market share of ASML is to out-innovate any competitors. Now, what's happening in the US is interesting, because there you see a company like Xlight, for example, which is developing, you could call it an alternative technology for EUV.
It's not EUV, yeah.
No, EUV is basically tin droplets that explode 50,000 times per second because they're hit by a very powerful laser, and they create ultraviolet light, extreme ultraviolet light, and that's the light with a wavelength of 13.5 nanometer, and then that's the light that has been cast around this optics system and gets to this level that it can create light with an accuracy of less than a couple of nanometers, and even 2 nanometers or sub 2 nanometers is an option with EUV. The other way to create light of the same wavelength is if you use electron accelerators, actually. So FEL is an accelerated technology, but you need a huge, I think the facility itself for such a FEL is about a football stadium. So it's a huge setup, and it creates light that's powerful enough to power, for example, 10 EUV machines. So that's not really granular, and you need 2 of them, because when there's a tool down or when the light tool is not working, the fab has to continue working. So it's pretty complex to build such a thing. The funny thing is that ASML also researched this FEL technology during the time when it was not completely sure that EUV would in the end work. But there was this pivotal moment back in 2015 when Martin van den Brink saw that ASML was capable of getting EUV running in an economically viable way. And he immediately shut down all the FEL research, because he thought we won't need it anymore. And by now, if you look at the roadmap, ASML is really confident that EUV created by these tin droplets will be the technology the whole entire world will depend on. But of course, there's still room for improvement, and there are a lot of other ways that you can have a lithography tool be replaced, but on a smaller volume. You could also use nano imprint or, for example, e-beam. But if you look at mass production, so that's logic and memory chips, then for ASML, EUV will be the way to go for first decade.
From your perspective, China seems to definitely be determined to get to that level. How about the US? Because there's a lot of startups. You mentioned one company. There is also the substrate company.
Yeah, we can talk about substrate because I think these are two different approaches. X-Lite is, I think, a very interesting research project, and they intend to cooperate with ASML and are quite optimistic that they can even have a tool ready in this year or next year and start experimenting with it. Well, we have to see if that isn't too ambitious. And I think the former CEO of Intel, Pat Gelsinger, is also part of the X-Lite team, or is the chairman. And the other company you just mentioned is Substrate, which is a startup. I think it's Silicon Valley based, but it has a completely different ambition. So it wants to use X-ray as another litho technology, which is an option, but there are a lot of technological hurdles for this X-ray technology to work. And this was also researched a couple of decades ago, and it was put aside because it was just too complex. And the ambition of Substrate goes even further. They want to build their own fabs as well. So they not only want to replace ASML, but also TSMC, which is, kind of an ambition that might be a bit far-fetched, in my humble opinion. So I think it's also demonstrating there's a lot of VC hype in this. So people are interested in, okay, what's the core technology now driving the AI race? And okay, it's chips. Part of it. It's not only modeling, but for better models, you need more compute, so better chips. So there's an interest in creating alternatives, and it's a good way to create hype and to attract investors that are willing to put, what was it, 100 million euros in it or dollars in it?
Something like that, yes.
Yeah.
And what is also interesting, even TSMC itself had difficulties to replicate its process in United States. So building that from the scratch seems to be a very big challenge, honestly speaking.
I agree. But you see that TSMC is expanding in the US, and of course they use a lot of Taiwanese talent to do so. Because if you look at one of the things that's holding back the US in this urge to up its chip manufacturing is you still need a lot of talented people, and the educational system has to be upgraded as well, and that takes a while.
And in all the researchers I have seen, one of the top challenges for the semiconductor industry in the United States is indicated talent shortage. So this is definitely something.
And if you look, of course, Taiwan is also worried, okay, what's going to happen to us when all of our advanced chip fabs are suddenly in other countries? Who's going to protect us? But it also makes sense to spread out semiconductor manufacturing all over the globe, because being dependent on such a small corner of the world for these crucial building blocks of modern society doesn't make sense. So if you look at just practical de-risking, that's like 15 to 20% of your manufacturing spread outside Taiwan. It makes sense. And for example, the fab in Dresden is like a carbon copy of a fab in Taiwan. And it's funny that I think the volume is about 10 to 15%. So it's still relatively small, but it's enough to create a certainty that if there's a hiccup, geopolitical, or it could be an earthquake or a fire, then you still have access to this crucial technology. And that, as we have learned during Corona, but also recently with the Nexperia crisis. These were not advanced chips, but we're so reliant on global semiconductor supply chain that we have to make sure that we have access to this source of chips that we are sure of, that we have it under any circumstances.
And you just touched the last topic I wanted to discuss with you, the Nexperia indeed. From your perspective, when we take a look on the Nexperia case, it's a very specific one, yeah, because we have an ex-Dutch-owned company which has been acquired a couple of years ago by Chinese owner, and right now we had at the end of 2025 this spark. There was a decision of Dutch government to assume the control over the company. From your perspective, this is kind of, I don't know how exactly to describe it, but the action which is to prevent what remained in Europe, to prevent the European supply chains, or there is something else behind? You were pretty extensive describing that case in your social media. That was a perfect source of information, what is happening in there. Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, how it looks and how this ends, because we had the court decision this week.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm not the one to judge where it will end. But for Nexperia, this was interesting because I started following that company about 20 months ago, before, excuse the word, shit hit the fan and things started exploding. Actually, I was expecting to write an inside story about a company that was kind of finding its way throughout these geopolitical turmoil, because it was a pretty balanced company. It had back-end manufacturing in China and front-end in manufacturing in Europe. It had a Chinese ownership, but Mr. Wing, but he was expanding or wanted to expand and invest in Europe. So, and he was really like a global player, and had this idea that he was gonna follow up on the Dutch or cooperate with the Dutch government. And so it was really interesting. It would be a positive story. Then things suddenly turned, and the whole situation exploded when I was within the company. So it gave me an opportunity to describe from the inside what went wrong there. And I think the Dutch government was worried that China, or the Chinese owner in this case, was misusing his position to shut down the semiconductor manufacturing of pretty cheap chips. So we're talking about cents in Hamburg, in Germany, and also in Manchester, in the UK, and to transfer IP and also manufacturing to China. And to prevent him to do so, they used an old law, pretty obscure law, to freeze the company. So they didn't expel him, or they didn't oust him, but they just prevented Nexperia from making big changes. The company was supposed to keep on running and producing like it was always producing. But then one day later, the European leadership, they took Ondernemingskamer, which is an enterprise chamber, a special judge in the Netherlands, and they filed a complaint there, and the enterprise chamber ex parte, which means there's not a real court session, immediately decided to expel Mr. Wing and take away his control over the shares. And it was really without any precedent. So there was a unique situation, because they were convinced, and now it is also official, that there has to be a certain research investigation in the Nexperia management, because Wing is suspected of fraud, actually, mismanagement. And so his fellow board members accuse him of using Nexperia money to fund or to save one of his other companies, which is a semiconductor manufacturing fab, a foundry called Wing Sky Semi. So this is playing out, but the result is that China was very much offended by the way the Dutch court and the Dutch minister intervened, and they kind of shut down the entire Dongguan backend factory in the Shenzhen area. And as a result, the whole automotive industry was suddenly, craving for chips. So there was a huge chip shortage. And these are not expensive chips, but really the standard products that you need in every device, and especially every car. And because it's not an expensive product, but it's an important product. And once it's not there anymore, suddenly it becomes crucial. And then at that stage, even the US started getting into this discussion, and ending up with Trump from the one side and Xi Jinping discussing Xperia matters in Korea. And I think they're still discussing it because this issue hasn't been resolved yet. And I think it's fascinating to see that it's another Dutch company, and it's another, you could say it's also Philips' legacy, just like ASML was Philips' legacy, but they're both completely different. So ASML is building these very expensive machines for just a handful of customers, and Xperia is building these or manufacturing these very cheap chips, but they have an abundance of customers, so they're like tens of thousands of customers. But they're both crucial players.
This is a very interesting case because right now we are in the situation where, in fact, under the same brand, under the same company, we have two different companies operating on its own. So I am very curious how the situation will end up, but this definitely also shows how vulnerable are the supply chains of European automotive industry, that even, as you mentioned, the small couple of cents chip could stop the production of Volkswagen factories, for example. And I think also Reuters was giving that information that at certain point of time, Volkswagen was buying from Nexperia Hamburg wafers, so Nexperia China can produce the chips for them. So the things which are unimaginable to a certain extent.
And it describes getting back to the CHIPS Act, the only way for the semiconductor industry in Europe to prosper is to be sure that there's an end market. And of course, the automotive industry is an important end market, but back-end manufacturing, of course, is part of the entire supply chain. So it would make sense to have a de-risk supply chain outside of China. And you see that was already being prepared by the Nexperia leadership. So they were supposed to have a local for local supply chain in China, and also a supply chain for the rest of the world. And what you see happening now is exactly the same, but now it's been forced by the Dutch government. So we have to see how it plays out during this negotiating with Nexperia and its formal owner in China, and of course the Dutch and the Chinese government.
Final question. Do you think that with this level of bureaucracy, which in Europe is right now present, or even Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, was raising that topic, do you think Europe will overcome this, bottleneck in its supply chains, or it will in the end kind of paralyzed in paper strategies? We had the Mario Draghi's reports. We have CHIPS Act 1, CHIPS Act 2 right now under discussion. There is a lot of strategies, a lot of documents being initiated by the European Commission and so on. But in the end, from like a gray citizen of Europe perspective, it looks that there is no action behind. There's a lot of papers, a lot of strategies, but the actions are not visible, at least.
I think the actions will take a while. It's of course starts with paper. I think Nexperia is one of the examples where there's action, and it created a crisis, but it also created the awareness with a lot of people. Okay, so we're actually depending on these very small chips that we deemed not too important recently. That's why we let NXP sell it to Chinese players. And you need a crisis for things to change. And I think it really helps. So that's it's a kind of help that the White House is now very clear that the relationship between Europe and the US is, well, changing. And I think you need a kind of a shock like that for things to happen. And the only way for Europe to change is when it is forced to change. And I think these kind of events help us forward. And of course, I totally agree with you. It usually is way too slow, and bureaucracy is part of a problem. And getting back to ASML, that even this company that got to this level of dominance, dominating this crucial market of lithography, is still battling its own bureaucracy. So recently it announced a reorganization of its technology department, so that's design and engineering, because it has too many indirect leaders. So the engineers are complaining that they have to spend too much time, doing bureaucracy stuff. So even a company like ASML is fighting its own demons on that part. I think it will help us forward. But I'm not the one to tell you that everything is going to be all right. We might be depending on this crucial technology for a long, long time. Also, not only on China, but also on the US, of course.
Let's conclude here. Marc, thank you very much for participating in that very interesting conversation and providing this very meaningful insight. We, of course, recommend your book, which is right now also available in Polish language. So for the Polish viewers, you can read it right now in our mother tongue. Marc Hijink, thank you very much. Wishing you a great evening.
Okay, thanks, Adrian.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.